The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. October 1988 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping faster than usual, and the Amish farmlands that dotted the countryside seemed to brace themselves against the coming cold. It was on one of these farms, nestled between two ancient oak trees and bordered by a creek that hadn't run dry in over a century, that Margaret Stoltzfus lived with her two daughters, 8-year-old Sarah and 12-year-old Rebecca. Margaret had been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband Jacob succumbed to pneumonia, leaving her to manage the 40-acre farm with the help of her girls and the occasional assistance from neighboring families. The Stoultz farm was known throughout the community for its pristine vegetable gardens and the quality of its dairy cattle. Margaret's butter and cheese were sold at the local market every Saturday, providing enough income to keep the family afloat while maintaining their simple, traditional way of life. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I'd love to hear from you, our viewers. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support means everything to us as we bring you these compelling true stories. On the morning of October 15, 1988, Margaret rose before dawn, as was her custom, lighting the oil lamps that would guide her through the morning chores. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet, she would later tell the police. Usually, she could hear the gentle breathing of her daughters in the adjacent room, the creaking of old floorboards as they stirred in their sleep, or the soft whispers they sometimes shared before fully waking. But that morning, there was nothing but the sound of wind rattling the windows and the distant lowing of cattle waiting to be milked. When Margaret pushed open the door to her daughter's room, her heart stopped. The beds were empty, covers thrown back as if the girls had left in a hurry. Sarah's favorite rag doll, the one she never slept without, lay abandoned on the floor. Rebecca's prayer book, which she kept on her nightstand and read every evening before bed, was missing. Margaret called their names, her voice echoing through the small farmhouse, growing more desperate with each unanswered call. She searched every corner of the property. The barn where the girls sometimes played hide-and-seek among the hay bales, the root cellar where they stored preserves for winter, even the old chicken coop that had been abandoned since a fox had gotten to the flock the previous spring. There was no sign of them anywhere. What troubled Margaret most was that there were no signs of struggle, no indication of what might have happened. It was as if Sarah and Rebecca had simply vanished into the crisp autumn air. By noon, when the girls hadn't returned and Margaret had exhausted every possible hiding place on the farm, she made the difficult decision to contact the English authorities. In their community, involving outside law enforcement was not taken lightly, but Margaret's maternal instincts overrode any concerns about breaking with tradition. She hitched up the buggy and rode to the nearest neighbor's farm, where she used their telephone to call the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Daniel Morrison had been working in Lancaster County for 15 years and had dealt with his share of missing persons cases, but something about Margaret Stoltzfus struck him as different. When he arrived at the farm that afternoon with Deputy Lisa Chen, he found a woman who was clearly distraught but remarkably composed, answering their questions with precision and providing details that many panicked parents might overlook. Margaret showed them the girls' room, pointing out that while the beds were unmade, none of their clothes appeared to be missing. Their winter coats still hung on pegs by the front door, and their outdoor shoes remained lined up neatly in the mudroom. They wouldn't have left without their coats, Margaret insisted, wrapping her black shawl tighter around her shoulders. Rebecca is practical like that. She always makes sure Sarah is properly dressed before they go outside, especially when it's cold like this. Deputy Chen, who had joined the force only 2 years earlier after completing her criminal justice degree, was struck by the lack of evidence at the scene. There were no footprints in the soft earth around the house beyond those that could be attributed to the family's daily routines. The dogs that lived on neighboring farms hadn't barked unusually during the night, and no one in the close-knit community had seen or heard anything suspicious. It was as if the two girls had simply disappeared into thin air. The search began in earnest the following morning. Volunteers from both the Amish community and the broader Lancaster County area joined law enforcement officers in combing through the woods that bordered the Stoltzfus property. They searched along the creek, thinking perhaps the girls had fallen in, but the water was shallow and the current gentle, hardly dangerous enough to sweep away two children, especially Rebecca, who was known to be a strong swimmer. They expanded their search radius daily, covering abandoned buildings, old wells, and every structure within a 5-mile radius of the farm. As the days turned into weeks, the case began to attract media attention. Reporters from Philadelphia and even New York descended on the quiet farming community, their cameras and microphones an intrusion that made many of the Amish families uncomfortable. Margaret, however, agreed to speak with anyone who might help find her daughters, even appearing on a local television news program where she made a tearful plea for information. "Sarah likes to pick wildflowers," she told the reporter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "She always brings them to me, tells me which ones are her favorites. Rebecca loves to read. She's always got her nose in a book. They're good girls, obedient girls. They wouldn't have just wandered off." The investigation revealed few leads. There had been no strangers seen in the area, no suspicious vehicles, no reports of anyone asking about the Stoltzfus family or showing unusual interest in the girls. The FBI was called in to assist, bringing resources and expertise that the local sheriff's department lacked, but even their sophisticated investigative techniques yielded nothing concrete. Polygraph tests were administered to Margaret and several neighbors, all of whom passed without incident. The girls' photographs were distributed nationwide, appearing on milk cartons and missing persons bulletins, but no credible sightings were ever reported. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the complete absence of any evidence suggesting abduction. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, no indication that the girls had been taken against their will. Their disappearance seemed almost voluntary, except for the fact that 8-year-old Sarah had never been away from her mother for more than a few hours in her entire life, and 12-year-old Rebecca was known for her strong sense of responsibility and would never have taken her younger sister anywhere without permission. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who consulted on the case, suggested that the girls might have left the house to help someone they trusted, perhaps a neighbor or family friend who had convinced them to come outside for what seemed like a legitimate reason. Children, especially those raised in close-knit communities like the Amish, are often taught to be helpful and trusting of adults, she explained to investigators. It's possible someone they knew asked for their help with something, and they agreed without thinking to wake their mother. This theory led investigators to take a closer look at everyone in the girls' extended social circle. They interviewed teachers from the one-room schoolhouse both girls attended, neighbors who regularly interacted with the family, and even the English customers who bought Margaret's dairy products at the Saturday market. Each person was thoroughly vetted, their whereabouts on the night of October 14th carefully documented and verified. But again, nothing suspicious emerged. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Lancaster County in snow by late November and effectively ending any hope of finding physical evidence outdoors. The case, while still officially open, began to fade from public attention as other news stories took precedence. Margaret continued to hope, continued to pray, but as the months passed, even she began to accept the possibility that she might never know what happened to Sarah and Rebecca. The impact on the tight-knit Amish community was profound. Parents became more protective of their children, and the easy trust that had characterized relationships within the community was shaken. Some families began locking their doors at night, a practice that had been virtually unknown in the area. The weekly gatherings and barn raisings continued, but there was an underlying tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that their safe, insulated world had been breached by something dark and unexplainable. Margaret struggled to maintain the farm on her own. Without her daughter's help with daily chores, and with her spirit broken by grief, she found it increasingly difficult to keep up with the demands of farming. The community rallied around her, with neighbors taking turns, helping with milking and fieldwork, but Margaret's heart was no longer in it. She would often be found standing in her daughter's room, holding Sarah's abandoned doll, or running her fingers along the spine of one of Rebecca's books, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers for their safe return. As 1989 turned into 1990, and then into 1991, the case files grew thinner. Occasional tips would come in. Someone thought they'd seen two girls matching Sarah and Rebecca's description in a shopping mall in Harrisburg or walking along a highway in Ohio, but each lead proved to be a dead end. The FBI eventually scaled back their involvement, leaving the case primarily in the hands of the local sheriff's department, where it languished among dozens of other unsolved cases. Sheriff Morrison, who had been deeply affected by the disappearance, continued to work the case even after his official retirement in 1995. He would drive out to the Stoltzfus farm periodically, walking the property and surrounding woods, always hoping to spot something that previous searches had missed. His successor, Sheriff Patricia Williams, inherited not only his badge, but also his commitment to finding answers for Margaret Stoltzfus, though she too found herself frustrated by the complete lack of evidence or viable leads. Margaret eventually made the difficult decision to sell the farm in 1994. The memories were too painful, and without her daughters, the land that had once brought her joy now served only as a constant reminder of her loss. She moved to a small house in town, closer to her sister's family, and took work cleaning houses for English families in the area. She aged rapidly in those years, her brown hair turning grey and her face bearing lines that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. The property was purchased by an English family, the Hendersons, who were drawn to the area's rural charm and the opportunity to restore an authentic Amish farmhouse. David Henderson was a contractor from Philadelphia who had grown tired of city life, and his wife Jennifer was a school teacher who dreamed of raising their young son in a more wholesome environment. They were aware of the property's tragic history. The real estate agent had been legally obligated to disclose the disappearance, but they felt that bringing new life to the old farm might somehow honor the memory of the missing girls. The Hendersons spent considerable time and money renovating the farmhouse, updating the electrical system and plumbing while trying to maintain the building's historic character. Jennifer was particularly drawn to what had been Sarah and Rebecca's room, which she converted into a bright, cheerful bedroom for their son Michael. She painted the walls a warm yellow and installed new windows that let in more natural light, hoping to banish whatever sadness might have lingered in the space. Over the years, the Hendersons became part of the Lancaster County community, with Jennifer teaching at the local elementary school and David building a successful contracting business specializing in historic restoration. They were aware that some of their Amish neighbors viewed them with a mixture of politeness and reserve. The farm would always be associated with tragedy in the collective memory of the community, but they worked hard to be good neighbors and responsible stewards of the land. Michael Henderson grew up on the farm, largely unaware of its history until he was old enough to understand the full story. His parents had told him that two girls had once lived in his room and that they had gone missing, but they shielded him from the more disturbing details until he was a teenager. Michael was a curious, energetic boy who loved exploring the woods and creek that bordered the property, often accompanied by Max, a golden retriever the family had adopted when Michael was 7 years old. It was Max who, in the summer of 2022, would finally provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for over 3 decades. By then, Michael was 25 years old and working as a software engineer in nearby Lancaster City. Though he still visited his parents regularly and often brought Max along for hikes through the familiar woods of his childhood. The dog, now 11 years old and slowing down considerably, had always been drawn to a particular area near the creek where a cluster of large boulders created natural caves and hiding spots. On a humid July afternoon in 2022, as Michael and Max were walking their usual trail, the dog suddenly became agitated near the boulder formation. Max began digging frantically at the base of one of the larger rocks, whining and pawing at the earth with an intensity that Michael had never seen before. Initially, Michael tried to call the dog away, concerned that Max might be digging up some long-dead animal or getting into something that might make him sick. But Max was persistent, continuing to dig even when Michael grabbed his collar and tried to pull him away. Finally, curiosity overcame caution, and Michael knelt down to see what had captured Max's attention so completely. The dog had managed to excavate a small area beneath the boulder, and there, barely visible in the disturbed soil, was something that made Michael's heart race. A small piece of faded blue fabric, the same color that witnesses had described Rebecca Stoltzfus wearing on the night she disappeared. Michael's hands trembled as he carefully extracted the fabric from the soil. It was clearly old, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements, but it was unmistakably a piece of clothing. Attached to the fabric was a small tarnished button, the kind used on children's dresses in the 1980s. Michael knew immediately that he needed to contact the authorities, but he also understood the significance of what Max had found. After 34 years, the first physical evidence in the Stoltzfus case had finally been discovered. Sheriff Williams, now in her 15th year leading the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department, responded to Michael's call personally. She had inherited the Stoltzfus case from Sheriff Morrison and had continued to review the files periodically, always hoping for a breakthrough that would provide answers for Margaret and closure for the community. When she arrived at the Henderson farm and saw the fabric that Max had unearthed, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was the break they had been waiting for, but it also meant that the investigation would have to be reopened with all the pain and scrutiny that would bring. The area around the boulder formation was immediately secured as a crime scene. State investigators were called in, along with a team of forensic archaeologists who specialized in excavating sites where human remains might be found. The work was painstakingly slow and methodical, with every square inch of soil being carefully sifted and examined. The media, dormant on this story for decades, suddenly resurged with renewed interest, though the Henderson family and law enforcement worked to keep details of the discovery confidential while the investigation proceeded. Margaret Stoltzfus, now 73 years old and living in a senior community in Lancaster, was among the first to be notified of the discovery. The years had been difficult for her. She had never remarried, never had other children, and had spent more than 3 decades wondering what had happened to Sarah and Rebecca. The news that evidence had finally been found brought her a complex mixture of hope and dread. Part of her wanted answers, needed to know what had happened to her daughters, but another part feared what those answers might reveal. Detective Sarah Hoffman, a specialist in cold cases who had been assigned to lead the reopened investigation, approached Margaret with sensitivity and professionalism. Detective Hoffman had experience with long-dormant cases and understood the delicate balance between pursuing justice and protecting the emotional well-being of victims' families. She explained to Margaret that while the discovery of the fabric was significant, it would likely take time to determine what other evidence might be found at the site and what story it might tell. The excavation continued for 2 weeks, with investigators working in the oppressive summer heat to carefully examine every inch of the area where Max had made his discovery. What they found told a heartbreaking story that had remained hidden beneath Lancaster County soil for over 3 decades. In addition to more pieces of clothing that matched descriptions of what Sarah and Rebecca had been wearing, investigators discovered personal items that Margaret was able to identify as belonging to her daughters. Rebecca's prayer book, its leather cover cracked and faded but still recognizable, and a small metal toy horse that had been Sarah's favorite. Most significantly, the excavation revealed human remains in what appeared to be a carefully concealed burial site. The bones were small, consistent with children of Sarah and Rebecca's ages, and forensic examination would later confirm through dental records that they were indeed the remains of the Stoltzfus sisters. The discovery brought an end to 34 years of uncertainty, but it also raised new questions about how the girls had died and who had been responsible for their deaths and concealment. Dr. Emily Carter, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, determined that both girls had died from what appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries were consistent with being struck by a heavy object, though the passage of time and condition of the remains made it impossible to determine more specific details about the weapon used or the exact circumstances of their deaths. What was clear was that this had been a violent crime, not an accident or case of the girls simply getting lost in the woods. The location of the burial site provided important clues about the perpetrator. The boulder formation where the girls were found was not visible from the farmhouse or any of the surrounding properties, but it was accessible via an old logging road that had been used in the area decades earlier. Someone familiar with the local geography would have known about this secluded spot, suggesting that the killer was likely someone from the community rather than a stranger passing through. Detective Hoffman began the complex process of re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned during the original investigation. Many of the people involved were now deceased. Sheriff Morrison had passed away in 2018, and several of the neighbors and family friends who had been interviewed in 1988 had also died in the intervening years. But Hoffman was able to track down most of the key figures from the original case and began comparing their statements from 1988 with what they remembered now. One name that kept appearing in the files was that of Samuel Brenneman, a neighbor who had been among those questioned in the original investigation. Brenneman had been in his 40s in 1988, unmarried, and living alone on a farm about 2 miles from the Stoltzfus property. He had been known in the community as something of an odd character, not unfriendly, but quiet and withdrawn, someone who kept to himself and didn't participate much in community gatherings. During the original investigation, Brenneman had claimed to have been at home alone on the night the girls disappeared, reading his Bible and preparing for bed early. He had no alibi beyond his own word, but there had been no evidence linking him to the disappearance. What Detective Hoffman discovered when she tried to locate Brenneman for re-interview was that he had left Lancaster County abruptly in early 1989, just a few months after the girls' disappearance. According to neighbors, he had sold his farm quickly and cheaply to a land developer and had moved away without providing a forwarding address. This sudden departure, coming so soon after the disappearance, had raised some eyebrows at the time, but there hadn't been enough evidence to justify treating him as a suspect. Tracking down Brenneman's whereabouts proved to be a challenge that would require extensive detective work. He had moved to Ohio initially, then to Indiana, and finally to a small town in Kentucky where he had lived under a slightly different name, Sam Brennan instead of Samuel Brenneman. Detective Hoffman worked with law enforcement agencies in all 3 states to piece together Brenneman's movements over the past 34 years and to determine if there had been any similar crimes in the areas where he had lived. What they found was disturbing. In Ohio, there had been reports of a man matching Brenneman's description seen near playgrounds and schools, watching children in ways that made parents uncomfortable. In Indiana, a neighbor had reported seeing him talking to young girls and offering them candy, though no crimes were ever reported. And in Kentucky, where he had lived for the past 15 years, there had been 2 cases of missing children, both young girls who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances and were never found. By the time Detective Hoffman was ready to question Brenneman, he was 77 years old and living in a rundown trailer in rural Kentucky. When she and Kentucky State Police arrived at his home, they found a man who seemed to have been expecting them. Brenneman was frail and clearly ill, but his mind was still sharp, and when Detective Hoffman identified herself and explained why she was there, he simply nodded and said, "I wondered when someone would finally come." The interrogation that followed lasted several hours and was conducted with careful attention to Brenneman's age and apparent health issues. Detective Hoffman began by asking him about his life in Lancaster County and his memories of the Stoltzfus family. Initially, Brenneman claimed to remember very little about the disappearance, saying that it had happened so long ago that the details were fuzzy. But as the questioning continued, inconsistencies began to emerge in his story. When pressed about why he had left Lancaster County so abruptly after the girl's disappearance, Brenneman initially claimed that he had simply wanted a change of scenery, that farm life had become too isolated for him. But Detective Hoffman had done her homework and knew that Brenneman had been deeply in debt at the time, owing money to several local businesses and facing the possibility of losing his farm to foreclosure. His sudden departure and quick sale of the property had actually cost him money, which contradicted his claim that he had left voluntarily. The breakthrough came when Detective Hoffman showed Brenneman photographs of the items that had been found with the girl's remains. When he saw the picture of Rebecca's prayer book, his composure finally cracked. His hands began to shake, and tears formed in his eyes as he stared at the photograph. After several minutes of silence, he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, his words coming slowly and with obvious difficulty. "I just wanted them to stop making so much noise. They were always laughing and playing near my property line, and it was distracting. I had trouble concentrating on my prayers, on my work. I thought if I could just talk to them, explain that they needed to be quieter." What Brenneman described was a crime that had begun with his twisted perception that the girl's normal childhood activities were somehow interfering with his life. On the night of October 14th, 1988, he had walked over to the Stoltzfus farm with the intention of speaking to Margaret about her daughter's behavior. But when he arrived at the house, he could see through the windows that Margaret was already asleep, and the temptation to deal with what he saw as the problem himself became overwhelming. He had tapped on the girls' bedroom window, telling them that their mother had sent him to get them, that there was an emergency with one of the animals in the barn. Rebecca, being the older and more responsible sister, had been suspicious, but Sarah was eager to help, and Rebecca didn't want to leave her younger sister alone with a strange man. They had dressed quickly and followed him outside, where he led them not to the barn but toward the woods, claiming there was an injured deer that needed their help. Once they were away from the house and in the secluded area near the boulder formation, Brenneman's story became even more disturbing. He claimed that the girls had begun to realize something was wrong and had started to cry and ask to go home. Rebecca had tried to take Sarah's hand and run back toward the house, which had triggered something in Brenneman that he claimed he couldn't control. "I picked up a rock," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted them to be quiet, to stop crying. But when I hit the older one, she fell down and wouldn't get up. The little one started screaming, and I couldn't let her go back and tell what I had done." Detective Hoffman listened with professional detachment as Brenneman described how he had killed both girls in what he claimed was a moment of panic, then spent the rest of the night burying their bodies in the hidden spot among the boulders, where they would remain concealed for the next 34 years. His decision to leave Lancaster County so soon after the crime had been motivated by guilt and fear, he said, though he claimed he had never intended to hurt the girls when he first approached them. The confession provided the answers that Margaret Stoltzfus and the Lancaster County community had sought for over 3 decades, but it also raised questions about justice and closure. Brenneman was clearly dying. Medical examination revealed that he had advanced lung cancer and likely had only months to live. The question of whether to prosecute him, given his age and condition, became a matter of considerable debate among law enforcement officials and the district attorney's office. Margaret, when informed of Brenneman's confession, expressed mixed feelings about the revelation. On one hand, she finally knew what had happened to Sarah and Rebecca, and she knew that their deaths had not been the result of some failure on her part as a mother. On the other hand, learning that her daughters had died in terror and pain at the hands of someone they had tried to help was almost more than she could bear. "I always wondered if I should have locked the doors," she told Detective Hoffman during one of their conversations. "If I should have been more careful, more protective. But how do you protect your children from evil that hides behind a familiar face? How do you teach them to be suspicious of everyone when that goes against everything we believe about community and trust?" The community's reaction to Brenneman's confession was complex and varied. Many people remembered him as a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor who had never shown any signs of violence or inappropriate behavior toward children. Others recalled feeling vaguely uncomfortable around him, sensing something off about his demeanor, but never being able to put their finger on what it was. The revelation that someone from within their own community had been responsible for the tragedy forced many residents to confront difficult questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and whether their traditional way of life left them vulnerable to predators. Samuel Brenneman died in a Kentucky hospital 3 months after his confession, before formal charges could be filed against him. His death meant that there would never be a trial, never be a moment in court where Margaret could face her daughter's killer and perhaps find some measure of justice or closure. But Detective Hoffman worked to ensure that the case was thoroughly documented and that Margaret received as much information as possible about the investigation and its conclusions. The remains of Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus were returned to Lancaster County for burial in the Amish cemetery, where their father Jacob had been laid to rest 15 years earlier. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the county, Amish and English alike, who had been touched by the family's tragedy and wanted to pay their respects to the 2 girls whose disappearance had haunted the community for so long. Margaret, now able to visit her daughters' graves and know that they were finally at peace, began the difficult process of healing from decades of uncertainty and grief. She established a small memorial fund in Sarah and Rebecca's names to support programs that would help protect children in rural communities, working with law enforcement agencies to develop educational materials for parents about recognizing potential threats and keeping their children safe without destroying the trust and openness that characterize traditional communities. Michael Henderson and his family were profoundly affected by their role in finally solving the case. Max, the golden retriever whose digging had led to the discovery of the burial site, was hailed as something of a hero, though Michael was careful to downplay the dog's role out of respect for the tragic nature of what had been found. The family continued to live on the farm, but they worked with Margaret to create a small garden on the property in memory of Sarah and Rebecca, planting wildflowers of the types that Sarah had loved to pick and placing a small bench where visitors could sit and remember the 2 girls. The case of Sarah and Rebecca Stoltzfus became a study in how long-dormant criminal investigations could be revived through new technology, persistent detective work, and sometimes just the instincts of a loyal dog. Detective Hoffman used the case as an example in training seminars for other law enforcement officers, emphasizing the importance of maintaining detailed case files and never completely giving up on unsolved crimes, no matter how much time had passed. For the Lancaster County community, the resolution of the case brought a mixture of relief and sadness. The uncertainty that had plagued them for 34 years was finally over. But the knowledge of what had actually happened to Sarah and Rebecca was almost more difficult to bear than not knowing had been. Parents found themselves having conversations with their children about safety and stranger danger that they had hoped never to have, while still trying to maintain the values of trust and community cooperation that defined their way of life. Margaret Stoltzfus lived for 3 more years after her daughter's remains were found and their killer identified. She spent those years working on her memorial fund and visiting schools throughout Lancaster County to talk to children about safety, always emphasizing that while the world could be dangerous, it was still important to be kind and helpful to others. She passed away in her sleep in the spring of 2025 and was buried beside Sarah and Rebecca in the quiet cemetery where 3 generations of her family now rested together. The farm where the tragedy had occurred continued to be home to the Henderson family, who had worked hard to honor the memory of the girls while building their own life on the property. The memorial garden they had created became a place where people from throughout the community would come to remember not just Sarah and Rebecca, but all the children whose lives had been cut short by violence and all the families who had endured the pain of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Max, the golden retriever whose discovery had finally brought answers to a decades-old mystery, lived for 2 more years after finding the burial site. When he passed away in 2024, he was buried in the memorial garden on the farm, with a small marker that read simply, "Max, good dog, faithful friend." His story became part of the larger legend of the case, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected sources, and that loyalty and persistence can triumph even over the passage of time and the best efforts of those who would hide the truth.